And welcome to all those who have decided to stay with the Mannin Line. My guests in the studio today, Chris Robertshaw, who I'll be talking to in just a moment over a certain issue. We'll tell you in just a moment. But first, before we get stuck into the programme, remember we do need to keep things within reason. So what you must say on this programme must be legal, honest, decent and truthful. Call 66 13 68, text 166 177 or email studio@manxradio.com. It's important you take part in this programme because that really, the second half, is what it's all about. Let's just read this out, because this is something that came in just before the news, and it's addressed to Mr. Robertshaw. I agree with Mr. Robertshaw in the steam packet purchase, long overdue, the same as when the government should have bought the airline Euromanx at the last moment. But I asked Mr. Robertshaw his thoughts on buying the debt of 74 million that has to be paid back. Why was it not bought at cost price, the price of the ships? The company has nothing else to offer.
Well, I'll do my best to give it a short answer.
Use both sides of paper if necessary.
Okay. The reason is a simple one. If we wanted to, as it were, buy control of the steam packet at the cheapest possible price, then we would have waited until almost till the user agreement came to an end. But by that time, enormous damage would have been done to the Isle of Man economy. One should bear in mind that the international finance organisations who owned the steam packet until last week would have been utterly preoccupied in sucking as much cash out of the service as they could between now and 2026, and would have done real damage to the island. So the price that's been paid is, and I know it's the area that people feel most uncomfortable with, but the price that's been paid also takes into account that we are protecting the well-being of the Isle of Man between now and 2026 in the first place. And secondly, it should be borne in mind that from this point onwards, as it were, margins and profits that made by the ferry company will come back to the Isle of Man that otherwise wouldn't have done. So if you fully engage in the process of the if, buts and maybes had we not, then you do arrive at a position where it is absolutely the right thing to do.
There was some mention of the packet having to pay back its debt, which presumably will mean that the fares cannot go to a level that most people feel they should go, because they're busy doing this and getting money back.
Well, there's a difference between the debt that existed prior to the purchase and the debt that exists now, because the debt was broken up into equity value of about 40 million, 44, 45 million, I think it is, and the rest as the caller or the person who texted in to message into
the equity was buying the shares in the company.
Yeah, and the £70 million is the debt. But the point is that £70 million debt now sits in a company which is owned by government, and if one knows a little bit about international finance, the most attractive debt, effectively, that exists, or investment, if you like, that exists, is a combination of something which is absolutely imperative to a place like the Isle of Man, which is the ferry service. It's our lifeline. It's not like investing in a company that might go bust. That lifeline is owned by the Isle of Man government and will always be here. That's the first thing. And the important thing to realise is that once the purchase has been made, which has now happened, it becomes possible over a much longer period of time to work out what you want to do with that debt. And there are a variety of different opportunities open to us. So it isn't a question that debt exists and it must be cleared by 2026. It's not like that. And so it isn't that same imperative that existed previously, where the previous owners would drain value out of the Isle of Man in order to pay their debt, the debts that existed. Now it's a different matter, and I'm confident that it won't be, John, that profound impediment that you quite reasonably suggested would be the case, that it will be an impediment to thinking about how we're going to structure the strategy within the user agreement in the years to come.
This has come from Anne. Could we not just set up another company and use the money to purchase new ferries in direct competition? Competition, of course, has been tried before.
Well, of course, that's where we came from, and that's where the user agreement, when it was first started, appeared in that chaotic situation that occurred in the 90s when the steam packet were trying to struggle into a new era and failed to do so as the tourist industry reduced in size. So the second thing one should bear in mind is that if one tried to set up a separate company, the then owners of the steam packet would carry on competing until 2026, and it should also be borne in mind that there's some reasonable argument that in a legal sense they would still have access to the link span after the end of the user agreement, so they could have carried on causing mayhem after the end of the user agreement should they have decided to do so. So it is really the right thing to have done.
The government holds all the shares. It's no thought of letting the public buy into this.
Well, you see, once government have signed up, as we have done, as the government has done, then new options open up, and there is a perfectly reasonable and rational argument in play that says, well, why can't the people of the Isle of Man in the future invest in the steam packet through, for example, some sort of Isle of Man investment fund? The sad thing at the moment, John, is that people on the Isle of Man who want to invest their money in projects that give a reasonable return, rather than putting it just in the bank and getting hardly anything back at all, have to place their money in organisations and trusts, etc., that are off island. So the Isle of Man is very busy at the moment making
money for everybody else.
Yeah, instead of ourselves. And so whoever asked that question raises a really interesting point. Can we consider some sort of development fund? One of the investments might well be the steam packet, so it's another way of funds flowing into the future of the Isle of Man. Actually, the options open to the Isle of Man government and to the Isle of Man as a whole, now that we own the ferry company, are quite exciting.
I suppose, Nigel Dobson, it underlines how important the government feels this question is, of actually having control of the steam packet.
I think it's quite right. I go back a few years, and when Manx Airlines lost their Heathrow slot, we should have taken over Manx Airlines. In my view, I would have preferred a closed sky policy, but that's gone. We have a closed port policy, effectively, through the user agreement, and I think Chris is absolutely right. If once Tynwald decided some months ago that they didn't like the idea of renewing the user agreement, then the current or the previous owners would have been perfectly justified in a commercial sense to run for cash for the next 9 years and just get rid of their debt, maximise their profit, and just walk away at the end of it. So I think strategically I can totally understand people objecting to the price. The value of a company isn't just its assets, it's also its income potential, its profit potential. I don't know whether it was the right price or not. I'm not privy to that information, but I think it was the right decision.
Well, the figures are there. If you want you out there to look at these figures, they are available on the government's website. You can actually see that the figures that were put together as they made this decision are available for you to scrutinise. It'd be interesting to hear out there your contributions to this, what you think, whether you think it was a good idea or not. But just in the meantime, just move on to this interesting calling in of the Legislative Council members. 5 of them were elected in the last election, all ladies. Women. I'm allowed to say women, I think. Jane Poole Wilson, Kate Lordbrand, Tanya August Hanson, Marlene Hendy and Kerry Sharp. They were called in to the Chief Minister, apparently because he was not really happy with some of the things they were saying. Is that the way we should read this, Mr. Robertshaw?
I think it's reasonable to read it that way, and it's another example. If you remember, in the previous programme we were talking about Daphne and the Children's Champion thing, and the Chief Minister calling that in. And here I think he was suffering from another element of control freakery, really, because These new members.
I can't understand why he hasn't got you in his cabinet.
the the new members are members of Tynwald, and what they're entitled to do and allowed to do is very, very clear. The fact that he called them in the way that he did was actually inappropriate in the first instance, because if there was a problem with the way LegCo members were conducting themselves, then it really is a matter for the president. Rather than the executive, the chief minister. If the chief minister thinks that he has absolute control over Tynwald, then he's sadly mistaken, because he hasn't. And there's what he's trying to do is sort of run with the fox and chase with the hounds, because he wants LegCo members to be members of departments, which is the executive side of government, but doesn't want them to be involved in executive matters. I mean, the confusion there is just extraordinary. My position is very clear. I don't think LegCo members should be members of departments. I've never been a member of a department, because I think you need to keep separation between parliamentary and executive process. But he's showing his mindset to be really confused at the moment, and I'm troubled by it.
I suppose there's two sides to this. Obviously, you do need to have a fairly firm hand being chief minister. That's what a chief minister's for, to be able to keep the troops in order, if I can put it that way. But also, right at the beginning of his term, his office, he did say his door was always open to people to hear their views. No.
The chief minister has a responsibility, John, to be in charge of the executive side of government. He is not in charge of Tynwald, which is the parliamentary process. And healthy government, healthy parliamentary process, and a balance between the two is extremely important. Otherwise, you can err towards bad decision making. If you don't have scrutiny, there's a problem. Also, one of the key roles of LegCo is to engage in the policy review committees, and I think the meaning is in the name, policy review committees, and that's just not historical mistakes made, but also developing policy. So I really don't know where the Chief Minister's coming from on this one.
Let's go to one of our callers. Leslie's back on the steam packet again. Leslie, your view on this. Do you have a view on this, or have you a specific question?
No, it's a query. I was on last week talking to Roger about it. Right. Now, according to the newspapers, the English newspapers we've been reading, the UK government, though it's leaving the EU in next March, it still hasn't got the technology or the system together to operate as a separate entity. So it's more and more likely there's going to be a transition period where the UK leaves the EU, but it has to follow all the rules. It's just like, say, an EFTA member or Norway, while they're getting all the technology into gear for the border in Ireland, etc., etc. Now, what I said last week was the UK leaves. It follows all the same regulations it would normally do as a member, but it's not a member. Now, we are not a full member of the EU. Now, when they leave in March, we'll leave in March. Now, I asked Roger, have they found out what status we will have in that transition period? Because if they lump us in with the UK and treat us like a full member of Europe, right, which we're not, but we could be. They might just turn around and say, we'll treat you the same as Norway in transition period. Full members of the EU have to obey competition law. And I can quote you, because I've been having a bit of a dig about this week. Under EU competition regulations, exclusive agreements aren't illegal per se, but all exclusive agreements are open to legal challenge through the courts, and the ultimate arbiter is the European Commission. Now, the point is, if we were lumped into the UK in March, we would come under those regulations, and basically the steam packets user agreement would be defunct. And that is most of what we're paying for. And I said last week, shouldn't they just check what our status is going to be in March before we actually sign on the dotted line? Because it might mean that in March, anyone could set up a ferry firm in competition, and the Manx government basically had just bought nothing.
Well, we've signed the dotted line now, obviously, so we have to work out the best deal possible. Do you feel concerned about what Miss Leslie has just said, Chris Robertshaw?
Well, if you go back originally to when the UK went into the EU, the Isle of Man was tagged on almost as a sort of an afterthought. Oh gosh, yes, we better deal with the Isle of Man, and that was dealt with under Protocol 3 because, as the caller says, we are not actually in the EU. The presumption in his concern, and I recognise what he's saying, the presumption in his concern is that there would be a complete failure on the part of the Isle of Man to represent itself in such circumstances, and it would beg a belief if the Isle of Man fell into that trap. I just simply cannot see it happening.
Well, Chris,
oh, hang on.
He's listening.
You say you can't see it happening. It's up to Brussels to decide what status we had in the transition period. Has anyone in the Manx government, as I said last week, contacted them and clarified how are they going to treat us? Lump us in with the UK as a full member. If so, the user agreement ceases because it can't comply with competition regulation, which applies to full members, but not people like the Isle of Man who have just signed Protocol 3.
We do have advisors, obviously, in Brussels, don't we, who are paid to actually keep us informed of this.
I asked this last week before they'd signed on the dotted line. They should clarify what our status would be before they signed on the dotted line. Have they done that?
Let's just see what Mr. Robertshaw has to say.
Well, first of all, the difficulty for the Crown dependencies, and the Crown dependencies are actually working together quite closely on the whole issue of how UK leaving the EU actually works out. That's important to say. The UK government have made it absolutely clear in their communications, their regular communications with the Crown dependencies, that they fully understand their duties and responsibilities towards the Crown dependencies. And I repeat, it is not a question of Brussels dictating to the UK that somehow overnight they can accept the Crown dependencies into the EU. That will simply not happen. And the Crown dependencies are very alive to protecting their interests. But obviously, because the whole situation is in such complete flux, it is very, very important to keep a very clear eye on what's going on.
I'm not saying that the Crown dependencies are going to be drawn into the EU. Yeah. What I'm saying is when the UK leaves, if there's a transition period, they will have to obey regulations like Norway, but they're not a member. We won't be a member either, or I should say we will not be involved with Europe because we'll come out with the UK. It's how is Brussels going to see us? Do they see us? Will they see us as just part? As a full member, like an EFTA person? And it's up to Brussels. It's not up to the UK because they'll be out. They'll have no say in it. Because if they say they're going to treat us the same as a full member, that means the steam packet agreement ceases.
Yeah, well,
let's just Mr. Robertshaw answer that.
Yeah. I think the assumption you're making is that the Brussels can dictate to Westminster that the Crown dependencies will be treated in a certain way, but the UK government knows it has a duty to protect that degree of separation that exists, and that would have to translate into any interim transitionary period, without doubt.
Let's just move on. Thank you very much, Leslie, for that. Let's just move on to a similar subject, and that's to do with the steam packet, and this is addressed to Mr. Robertshaw. Can you confirm or deny whether or not a newly formed marine consultancy firm will have any dealings with the government's running of the steam packet? Have you heard of anything in this nature? Consultancy firm?
All I can tell you is that the Treasury, when they were dealing with the whole matter of purchase of the steam packet, were very, very careful indeed to wrap around themselves a very, very competent team of consultants who dealt with a whole range of matters, and it was pleasing to see the quality of the presentations that those consultants made to members of Tynwald and gave members of Tynwald real confidence. whether Treasury, whether Council of Ministers continue to take further advice in the interim period, for example, in constructing the user agreement, I can't speak for Council, obviously, but what do I think? I think it would be sensible to make sure that we got the next user agreement right, and if it needs further advice, professional advice, then we should take it. I know of nothing else.
Well, that's one big subject. Let's go to another one. That's sewage, which has been occupying the island for decades. Quite a debate developed in Tynwald over the plan for the west of the island. This is Peel and Kirkmichael. One of the problems with Peel and Kirkmichael is that what happens in Kirkmichael can end up on the beaches of Peel, and what happens in Peel, depending on the direction of the wind, can end up on the beaches of Kirkmichael. But there was quite a spat over this, and Chris Robertshaw, as a member of the Environment and Infrastructure Policy Review Committee, said, amongst other things, what was ignored was what he termed legacy issues. He called the report far from independent, a dangerous precedent for reviewing major infrastructure projects. Can you put fairly briefly why you have all these concerns?
Okay, yeah. Well, first of all, Tynwald required of government that because of the huge expenditure going into the necessary sewage work improvements that have been going on all around the Isle of Man, that every 5 years there should be an independent report. That independent report was years late, and I would suggest it probably only came about because the Policy Review Committee decided it was going to look at what was going on. But far more important than the massive delay was the fact that that report was not independent, which I think is shameful, because the consultant involved was completely engaged in the process of developing the sewage capital works way back to since 2006.
This is M.W. Barber Associates.
Yeah, so what effectively government were doing was asking somebody involved in the sewage capital works to mark their own homework. And I've been following the whole process now since 2010, and I found that absolutely unacceptable. There were fairy stories flying around about the Policy Review Committee's work. There was the suggestion we were trying to stop what was happening in Peel. Nothing was further from the truth, because what we were trying to do was make absolutely sure, and still are, make absolutely sure that whatever's delivered in Peel is the right project, and also to deal with the legacy fault issues which the independent reviewer, so-called independent reviewer, was trying to cover up. And that is that there are inadequacies at this end of the Central Valley, involved in whether there should be a pumping station at Quarterbridge, and the overflows that we've seen in down by Tesco's Lake Road area. There are real inadequacies, and
you spoke of the Quarterbridge pumping station, which you said should have been built.
Absolutely, yes.
And you say it's going to have effect on future development in the area of Douglas.
Yes, because at the moment, all the sewage from Annika and Braddon and West Douglas and up to Union Mills, instead of going straight up to Merryveg as it should have done via Whitehoe, it's all sent down to Loch Prom and then pumped all the way back up the hill again. And there's not enough capacity in the system to cope with that. So what they've done is produced effectively an overflow facility which dumps the sewage into the river. And that's why we see problems this end that we shouldn't be seeing. And we were just trying to make sure, and we continue to do this, make sure that they get Peel right and fix Douglas. And it's going to cost more money. But what we were passionate about in terms of Peel was that right from the get-go, the argument was, if you're going to use the outflow pipe in Peel Bay, that you extend it to make absolutely sure that the flow leaving the sewage works is put
doesn't come back again.
Doesn't come back in, because there's a clockwise circular flow which brings stuff back, and there was a massive attempt to make it look as if the Policy Review Committee were just being awkward and trying to stop things. We were not. We were trying to we were trying to point at areas where there were inadequacies, where there were compromises being delivered in a way that should be unacceptable if we're going to comply with 2006 EU water standards.
Just talking about Laxey, what's the state with Laxey at the moment?
Well, I think last week there was some progress insofar as I think it's been agreed that budgets will be made available for the Laxey and Lonnon beaches, which they're amongst the last.
One
to
of
be
your
done on
problems
the
is
island.
rock, isn't it? You've got a heavy rock in that area, which protects you from erosion. It is difficult to drill through.
In fairness to the powers that be, we've been talking with them for the Manx Utilities for about 18 months, 2 years now, and there has to be a lot of testing going on for environmental concerns and water flows and tidal patterns and all this kind of thing, and that has been going on. I know that some land has been purchased ready for a sort of treatment thing, and so it's progressing. I mean,
Because there's a pipe just beyond the harbour, isn't there?
yes, there is.
I know, I paddled up there.
yeah.
I used to paddle swiftly through that area, and sometimes a little out to sea where I can manage.
Yes, well hopefully that we'll get to a state where we're not discharging into the sea. The thing that disappoints me a little bit, I suppose, that I moved to the island in 1997, and I think it was 98 or 99. I used to pop into the Queen's on the prom. And the road was dug up, and there were hoardings there because they were putting in this state-of-the-art new sewerage system that was going to serve the whole island. And 20 years later, we're still trying to get clean beaches. So, come on, let's get on with it.
Let's take a break.
Joint Radio.
Hello, you're listening to the Mannin Line off the back of Present Politics, and my guests in the studio, Nigel Dobson, Chairman of Garff Commissioners, and also Chris Robertshaw, from Tynwald, the member, a prominent backbencher, and joining us now is Roger from Mackle, who wants to talk the subject we've been talking about for the last few minutes, and that is the sewage system. Roger, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. I just want to pick up on the previous topic. Now, the Environment Infrastructure Policy Review Committee, that was the first report of that committee for 2017-18, and it dealt specifically with the Regional Sewage Treatment Strategy Phase 2 for Peel. Now, as Mr Dobson, Chair of the Garff Commissioners, is there, Phase 3 includes the Laxey treatment works, and one of the recommendations of the committee, which was subject to an amendment, which I didn't understand, and perhaps Chris Robertshaw can fill me in on this, was that they recommended that the existing bathing water quality standards are inadequate, and that provision must be made to adopt the 2006 EU Bathing Water Directive as soon as possible. Is the 2006 directive the latest EU directive, or is it just an acceptable one? So there's a question there for Chris and also for Nigel Dobson, if I may.
Well, let's just try Mr Dobson first.
Yes, certainly our bathing waters are not good enough. As I said, we've been doing a lot of work with Manx Utilities for a couple of years now, and pestering them to some extent. We have one or two of our members on the board who are very keen on seeing this progressed. And as I say, this week we seem to have had some good news that budgets will be made available, and hopefully in the next 12-18 months we'll finally get clean bathing waters in Laxey and Belfast.
Interestingly, you've got someone in charge of Manx Utilities who's a doctor who must appreciate the dangers that can be caused by bacteria in the waters.
Absolutely. When we've spoken to them, they've been very cooperative and very keen to get this work done. But the work is reliant upon getting funds from government, of course. And my impression now, perhaps Chris can correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression now is that government are ready to spend the money necessary to get this next phase done in Laxey and Lonnon.
Mr Robertshaw.
Yeah, that's my understanding too, to answer that question. But to come back to Roger's question, as I think he'll recall, the previous standards, the EU standards to 2006 were 1976, and the Isle of Man was complying with them. But those standards no longer exist. The updated standards is the 2006 water standards. They're called water bathing standards as people know it, and think of just blue flag beaches, but it's a lot more than that, and it's also concerned with the inland waterways and what one should be achieving. The committee, as Roger says, was and is very keen to make sure that the Isle of Man now faces up to the challenge of meeting 2006 standards. But government continually shies away from that, saying it's an aspiration and it's something we'd like to achieve and work towards. But Roger, if you go into the depth of the so-called independent report, you'll begin to quickly understand that I think Barber is his name. Barber fully understood that there are impediments to the Isle of Man achieving those standards, and the reason for that are the legacy faults that the authorities are trying to shy away from. And so that's the problem, and it's further exacerbated, I would argue, because DEFRA is responsible for water standards, but as effectively, because the regulator for water standards sits inside an executive element of government, it means that again they're marking their own homework. And I'm not alone in saying that the regulators should sit outside of executive government, not inside of it. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to make it opaque. Perhaps it's a bit of a pun, but they're trying to muddy the water a little bit and say, yes, we believe in this, but actually they know for a variety of reasons, and they know what those reasons are, that they can't achieve them.
Can I just make a point here? Unfortunately, that can happen when you have a very wet summer or very wet winter. And stuff comes off the land into the sea. That can affect the water quality as well, can't it?
Yes, and
that's coming from farms and things.
Yes, and quite rightly, the government say that is a problem. But at a recent meeting between the Environment Infrastructure Committee and DEFRA, I specifically asked that question, that should it be the case that the Agricultural Development Scheme should recognise the absolute importance of making wash-off from agricultural land into the rivers an issue of import in terms of attribution of funding. And the understanding I had from the Minister was that, yes, they were very aware of that and they would be working towards solutions. So it's not just a question of working towards solutions on sewerage standards, but also wash-off standards. So they run hand in glove, as it were, or parallel.
Roger.
John, can I just make a couple of points?
Of course.
Yeah.
To pick up on what you said earlier about footpaths, how they need to get the package right. Well, the total tourism package should be drawn together. And not only should it include footpaths, as you rightly point out, where the standards are abysmal, I feel, at the moment, it should also include bathing water quality, because that, after all, should be part of a tourism package. And the other thing is, I'm a bit concerned by Nigel Dobson's, what appears to me, and I may have got this wrong, laissez-faire attitude, saying that the DOI are in consultation with us, but as we've just heard from Chris Robertshaw, they haven't taken on board what the Select Committee has said and the recommendations of the Select Committee have said in terms of Peel. And here we are, in a few years' time, we're going to have a sewage treatment work built in Laxey, and myself, as a near-Laxey resident, I would like to see the latest standard of bathing water quality. So can I urge Mr. Dobson just to get active on behalf of the commissioners, making sure that we get the standards that we all deserve, really.
Roger, thank you. Just quick reply to that, Chris Robertshaw.
Yes, well, the committee also, Roger, has concerns about the leachate, which they intend to continue pumping out into Peel Bay, and the committee take the view that the Peel Beach is just a wonderful facility, and we must do all and everything necessary to protect it, and we should not arrive at compromised solutions. What I would say in defence of the MU here is that I have a significant degree of confidence in the new MU leadership. The problems that they're not being faced up to are the legacy faults, which the consultants and the independent reporters have tried to hide. And all we need to do is say, what are those legacy faults? How are we going to solve them? Let's move on.
We'll have to take, speaker moving on, another of these. Listening to the Mannin Line, running out of time, really, at the moment. Chris Robertshaw and Nigel Dobson, my guest. This from a listener. Wouldn't it be sensible to address the eyesores on the prom before work begins later this year on the promenade itself? Or is this madness unstoppable now that a few heads have been nodded? And just moving on to another subject, because we're heading towards the end of the programme. Ports and Mary Commissioners, newly elected chairs, played down speculation over a possible merger with a neighbouring local authority. It has been mooted that perhaps Ports and Mary and Port Erin might come together. I'd call them Ports and Marion or something like that. But Dr. Hayward, who's taken over, Michelle Hayward, says it isn't the case and no changes would be made, at least without public consultation.
I don't have a hidden agenda. I am honest. I pride myself on my integrity and I'm not running a hidden agenda. You can't stop members of the public coming and talking to you about particular issues, and that happens on a regular basis. It would be wrong to dismiss those concerns and views, and equally it would be wrong to go and act on the views of 20 people in a room on a particular evening. Democracy works if everyone's involved and everyone's consulted, and that's what I would look to do with any changes that come forward.
We've got another ad break to take, unfortunately, but just a quick comment before we come back to it after the break, Nigel Dobson. You obviously at Garff have brought together three and it's working well.
It is. It's working very well. Just referring back to our previous caller, there's nothing laissez-faire about the way we're doing things. We're getting things done in a much
This
faster
is about
way.
sewage provision in Laxton.
And generally speaking, we like to think we're a very proactive authority, and we're getting
Has
things
it made
done
a difference to what you are able to do? They're coming together. You're a bigger battalion.
Yes, I think so, because being a bigger battalion, people listen to you more, particularly people in the House of Keys. You get more response if you're representing more people, if you like. One authority now represents 3 times what 3 single authorities held. We've made all sorts of efficiencies in staffing, in subcontracting, in tendering process. We have a higher value product.
Would you advise Port Erin and Ports Mary to get married?
I would advise them to listen to their public, but believe me, their public will be there. They don't come out in their 20s and 30s, they come out in their 100s.
We're going to have to take another of these, I'm afraid. Very nearly at the end of the programme, the Mannin Line. Thanks for your contributions to everyone. I just want to touch upon something that is a bugbear with some people, and that's caravans coming to the island. I know if you go behind them, I was behind a particularly large one yesterday that was trundling along at 20 miles an hour. Very, very good stopping the traffic going too fast. But anyway, caravan owners could be affected, we understand, by new laws put forward by Port Erin commissioners. Nigel Dobson, in your area, you've got little country lanes, etc.
I think little country lanes are a huge problem for towing caravans on the island. There have always been sort of an anti-caravan thing. But one of the big problems we have in our patch, not just for caravans but for the camper vans, is where do you park them? Because people don't park them on their drives. They tend to get parked on the roads and not an easy situation.
I must admit, the idea of finding a pleasant spot and staying for the night is very appealing.
Yeah.
But then again, you can find yourself in trouble with the landowners, can't you?
And there are bylaws different in different parts of the island. The bylaws about how long you can stay in. You've got to look out for refuse disposal and that kind of stuff.
But it would help tourism, wouldn't it? I mean, people coming across.
I'm not sure that caravans around the island's roads are, as tourists, are the market we should be aiming at.
Yeah. Chris Robertshaw, do you have got any feelings on caravans?
Well, just that this conversation over all the years I've been involved comes up periodically, whenever the interview has been blocked by a vehicle in front. But
it can be annoying, but then
right.
If you want to get somewhere quickly, it can be annoying.
I just think it's if we're going to move forward further on this, then we need to make sure that it's delivered in a way that's acceptable. I mean, I don't think I've got a lot to contribute to that.
You'd have to have the facilities, and currently we don't have caravan parks. We don't have camping grounds designed to take those type of vehicles in any significant number.
Nigel Dobson, Chairman of Garff Commissioners, and Chris Robertshaw, prominent backbencher in the Keys. Thanks very much for joining us today, and also to Mr. Skelly, who was with us for the first hour of the programme, the Minister for Enterprise. And thank you out there, listeners and contributors, all making this programme what it is, the Mannin Line. I'm John Moss. Thank you very much for listening.